Roy had not planned to be there. He had come to the Dragon Highlands 3 weeks ago with a worn leather satchel, 2 broken quill pens, and a notebook already half full of careful drawings. He was a traveling scholar, not a famous one, not a rich one, just a quiet young man who had spent most of his life walking from one place to another, writing down things that other people had forgotten. The Dragon clan had allowed him to stay. That alone was unusual. Most clans turned humans away at the ridge. But the elder Marin had looked at him for a long moment and then simply said he could sleep in the outer hall and eat with the younger dragons if he kept his notebook put away during meals. Roy had agreed without hesitation. He had spent his weeks there being careful. He bowed when he was supposed to bow. He stayed quiet when the elders spoke. He never stared, even when the dragons shifted shape or breathed long ribbons of colored flame into the evening sky. He simply watched and wrote and tried very hard not to be a bother. He had not expected to be invited to the ceremony. Marin had come to him on the morning of the 3rd week and told him that the rite of the first breath was to be held that evening. It was the most sacred ceremony of the clan, the bonding rite, where a dragon bride offered a piece of her fire soul to her chosen partner. Marin said that Roy was welcome to observe from the back of the hall, behind the stone pillars, as long as he remained still and silent. Roy had nodded and thanked her quietly. The hall that evening was unlike anything he had ever seen. The ceiling was high and carved from dark stone, and along the walls burned hundreds of small flames in shallow bowls, all of them connected, Marin had explained, to the sacred flame at the center of the room. That central flame was tall and gold and old. It had been burning without interruption for over 400 years. The dragon bride stood before it. Her name was Sarah. Roy had seen her before briefly in the outer courtyard, tall with dark bronze scales along her arms and neck, and eyes the color of fire at its hottest point. She wore a ceremonial robe of deep red and gold, and she stood very still before the sacred flame with her hands folded and her chin lifted. She was supposed to kiss her chosen partner when the flame reached its peak. The partner, a young dragon from a neighboring clan, was standing beside her. Then everything went wrong. One of the great hanging ceremonial stones above the altar, a flat disc of granite carved with old symbols, suspended by thick rope, had been weakened by years of heat from the flame below. The rope gave without warning. The stone swung hard and wide and struck the neighboring clan's dragon across the shoulder. It hit Roy square on the side of the head. He did not even have time to be surprised. One moment he was standing behind the pillar with his hands folded, watching carefully. The next, the floor came up to meet him and everything went dark. He did not hear the gasps from the gathered clan. He did not see the neighboring dragon stumble back and refuse to continue, shaken and embarrassed and wanting no part of a ceremony that had already gone so badly. He did not hear the murmuring that spread through the hall like a wind through dry grass. He did not see Sarah's face when she turned and looked at him lying on the stone floor. He did not know that the sacred flame was already beginning to shrink. Marin moved quickly to Sarah's side and spoke in a low, urgent voice. The flame had to be met before it fell below the altar line. If it did, the bond could not be completed. Sarah's fire soul, the piece of it she had already offered forward in preparation for the rite, would scatter and fade. It would not kill her. But it would leave her diminished in a way that could not be undone. The hall was very quiet. Sarah looked at Roy on the floor. She looked at the flame. She looked at Marin, who said nothing more, just held her gaze and waited. Then Sarah walked to Roy. She knelt beside him on the cold stone. She could hear the murmuring behind her, but she did not look back. She could feel the warmth of the sacred flame on her back, shrinking. She had perhaps 1 minute. She leaned down and pressed her lips gently to his. It was meant to be a transfer, just enough to save the fire soul fragment she had already released. A desperate measure. A practical one. Nothing more. But the moment her lips met his, something happened that she had not expected. The flame did not just hold. It surged. Every small flame along the walls flared bright and tall at the same moment. The carved symbols on the fallen stone began to glow faintly where it lay on the floor. The air in the hall grew warm all at once, the kind of warm that sits in old stone after a long summer. And Roy's chest, just beneath his collarbone, began to glow gold through his shirt. Sarah pulled back and stared. The murmuring in the hall had stopped completely. Every dragon in the room was still. Roy lay on the floor, unconscious and glowing, breathing slowly and steadily. The light in his chest pulsed once, like a heartbeat, and then settled into a quiet, steady shine. Marin stepped forward slowly. She looked down at Roy for a long moment. Then she looked up at Sarah. She said only 4 words in a voice very quiet and very careful. That should not be. Roy woke up warm. That was the first thing he noticed. Not the stone floor beneath him, not the unfamiliar ceiling above him, not the faint sound of voices somewhere nearby. Just the warmth, deep and steady, sitting right in the center of his chest like a coal that had been burning quietly for hours. He lay still for a moment, blinking at the ceiling. Then he sat up. The hall was quieter now. Most of the clan had moved back, forming a loose half-circle a respectful distance away. The small flames along the walls were still burning, but softer now, back to their usual gentle flicker. The sacred flame at the center had returned to its normal height, tall and gold and calm. Roy looked down at his chest. There was no glow now. Just his shirt, slightly wrinkled, same as always. He pressed one hand flat against his sternum and felt the warmth there, steady and deep, like pressing your hand against sun-warmed stone in late afternoon. He looked up and found Sarah watching him. She was standing a few feet away, still in her ceremonial robes, her fire-colored eyes fixed on him with an expression he could not quite read. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was something closer to the look a person gets when they have just witnessed something they cannot explain and are still deciding how to feel about it. Roy opened his mouth, then closed it again. Marin stepped forward before he could find any words. She was older than any creature Roy had ever stood near. Her scales were deep gray, almost silver at the edges, and her eyes were amber and very steady. She moved slowly but not weakly, the way very old things move when they have learned that there is no longer any need to hurry. She crouched down in front of Roy so they were level with each other and looked at him carefully. Not unkindly, but very, very carefully. She reached out and placed 2 fingers against his chest, just below the collarbone where the glow had been. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she sat back and let out a slow breath. She told him, in simple and measured words, that he should not be alive. That the fire soul fragment Sarah had transferred during the rite was not a small thing. It was a piece of genuine dragon flame, old and concentrated, shaped over years inside Sarah's chest. When it entered a living body, that body needed to be built to hold it. Dragon bones. Dragon blood. Dragon breath. A human body, she said, should have burned from the inside in a matter of seconds. Roy listened without interrupting. He had learned, in his years of traveling, that the most important thing you could do when someone older and wiser was explaining something was to keep your mouth closed and your ears open. Marin then said something that made the whole hall go quiet again. She said that humans had not always been what they were now. That a very long time ago, further back than most written records reached, humans and dragons had shared something. Not blood. Not magic. Something smaller and quieter than that. A biological trait, buried so deep in the human body that it had stopped expressing itself generations and generations ago, like a seed that had been sitting in dry ground for 1,000 years waiting for rain. She called it the ember seed. She said that in all her years she had never seen one wake. She had read about it in texts so old the pages had to be held together with careful thread. She had believed it was possible, the way you believe something written in a very old book, respectfully but without real expectation. Roy looked down at his chest again. He asked quietly if it was dangerous. Marin considered the question seriously, which he appreciated. She said she did not believe so. The warmth he felt was the fragment settling, finding the ember seed and recognizing it, the way a flame recognizes fuel and chooses to burn steady rather than wild. It would take time. But she did not think it would harm him. Roy nodded slowly and said that was good to know. Someone in the gathered clan made a short sound, not quite a laugh but close. A few others exchanged glances. There was something about the way the humans simply nodded and said that was good to know. No dramatics, no trembling, no grand reaction. That seemed to land strangely in a hall full of dragons who had just witnessed something that had not happened in 1,000 years. Sarah felt it before she understood it. That was the strangest part of the morning for her. She had known, in theory, that a completed bond meant a connection, a faint awareness of the other person like a second heartbeat running alongside your own. She had expected it. She had prepared for it. She had not prepared for what she actually felt. When Roy had woken up and pressed his hand to his chest, she had felt the curiosity in him, quiet and genuine, like a man examining an interesting rock he had found on a path. When Marin explained what had happened, she felt him grow very still and very focused inside, the way a person goes still when they are truly listening. When he asked if it was dangerous, she felt something underneath the question. Not fear but a kind of responsible concern, the feeling of someone checking not for their own sake but because they wanted to make sure they would not be a burden to anyone else. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She had kissed him to save herself. That was the truth of it and she knew it. She had not thought of him at all in that moment, just the flame and the fragment and the seconds running out. But the ember in his chest was burning steady and honest and warm, and she could feel every beat of it. Drath arrived on the fourth morning. Roy heard him before he saw him. There was a sound like distant thunder, and then the great doors of the outer hall swung open without anyone touching them, pushed by a wave of hot air that made every small flame in the corridor lean sideways at once. Drath was large. That was the first thing Roy noticed. Not just tall, large in the way that old mountains are large, the kind of size that does not need to announce itself because every room it enters already knows. His scales were dark red, almost black at the edges, and his eyes were the flat, cold yellow of old brass. He wore no ceremonial robes. Just a heavy cloak the color of dried blood, and the calm expression of someone who had never once in his life been told no. He walked to the center of the hall and stopped. He said, without greeting anyone, that the bond was a mistake and that he was there to have it undone. Marin stepped forward. She was half his height and did not move back a single step. She told him, very calmly, that the rite of the first breath had been completed before the sacred flame, that it had been witnessed by the full clan, that it was, by every law of dragon custom, binding. Drath looked at Roy. Roy was standing near the far wall with his notebook tucked under his arm. He had been in the middle of writing something when the doors blew open. He looked back at Drath with the same quiet, attentive expression he used when he was studying something new. Drath said that a human could not hold a dragon bond, that it was an insult to centuries of tradition, that if the clan would not void the ceremony willingly, he would invoke the right of challenge, 3 trials of dragon worth, to be completed by the bonded partner. If the partner failed even one trial, the bond would be declared void by the old laws. The hall was very quiet. Marin looked at Roy. Roy set his notebook down carefully on the nearest ledge. He straightened his shirt. Then he looked at Drath and said, simply and without any heat in his voice, that he accepted. Drath blinked. Just once. Then his expression settled back into cold certainty. The first trial was the flame trial. It was simple in design. The candidate stood inside a ring of dragon fire, real fire, breathed by 3 elder dragons simultaneously, for a count of 60. A dragon body could endure it through scale and blood. A human body, everyone in the room understood, should not be able to endure it at all. Roy stepped into the ring without hesitating. The fire came from 3 directions at once, gold and orange and deep blue, the hottest kind. It roared and it filled the ring completely, and for a moment Roy disappeared inside it entirely. Sarah felt her breath stop. Through the bond she could feel him. Not panic, not pain, but something calm and almost curious, like a man standing in heavy rain and choosing to simply let it fall. The ember in his chest had flared the moment the fire touched him, rising to meet it, and the fire had done something that fire had apparently not done in 1,000 years. It had recognized him. It did not consume him. It moved around him, through him almost, the way flame moves around a stone that has been sitting in a hearth for so long it has become part of the fire itself. When the count reached 60 and the elder dragons pulled their breath back, Roy was standing in the center of the ring. His shirt was warm. His hair was slightly wild. He was otherwise completely unharmed. The hall did not make a sound. Drath's jaw was tight, but he said nothing. He moved on to the second trial. The lore trial was a recitation. 3 questions about dragon history, deep history, the kind that most living dragons knew only in broad strokes. The dates of the great clan treaties. The name of the flame that had burned at the founding of the Highland Halls. The 7 words of the original bonding rite in the old tongue. Drath asked the first question with the confidence of a man who already knew the answer was impossible. Roy answered it correctly, including the exact season and the name of the elder who had signed first. Drath asked the second. Roy answered it without pausing, and then quietly mentioned that there was some disagreement among older texts about the spelling of the flame's name, and offered both versions. Someone in the clan made a very small sound. Drath asked the third question through a jaw that was no longer quite so relaxed. Roy answered it word for word in the old tongue, with the correct pronunciation, and then added that he had found 2 slightly different versions in 2 different manuscripts and had always wondered which was considered authoritative. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than before. The third trial was the trial of heart. There were no flames and no questions. Drath simply told Roy to stand before the clan and speak, to say whatever he felt was true. Roy stood quietly for a moment. Then he said that he wanted to be honest about something. He said that he had not chosen any of this. He had been standing behind a pillar with a notebook, trying not to be in the way, and then he had woken up on the floor changed. He said that Sarah had made a very hard choice in a very short amount of time, and she had made it to save something important, and he thought that deserved to be said plainly and out loud, because she had received no credit for her courage and he thought that was wrong. He said nothing about himself. Not one word. 3 of the elder dragons looked away. One closed her eyes. Drath stood very still. Then he turned and walked to the doors. He stopped once without turning back, and said that greater powers than he would come asking questions about a human ember carrier. He said it like a warning. Then he left. Marin watched the doors close. Then she looked at Roy, who had already picked his notebook back up from the ledge. She said nothing. But for just a moment the corner of her old mouth lifted. The days after Drath left were quieter. Not uncomfortable quiet, just the kind of quiet that settles over a place after something large and loud has passed through it. The clan moved through their routines carefully, the way people do when they are still thinking about something but are not yet ready to speak about it out loud. Roy moved through his routines too. He woke early, ate whatever was placed in front of him without complaint, and spent most of the daylight hours in the corner of the outer hall with his notebook. He was writing everything down, not just observations about the clan but everything that had happened since the ceremony. The warmth in his chest. The way the fire had moved around him in the trial. The old tongue words he had recited, and the 2 manuscript versions, and which one he now suspected was more accurate based on the root structure of the syllables. He was, at his core, a scholar. Strange things had happened to him. The correct response, in his view, was to write them down carefully. Sarah found him there on the second morning. She did not say anything at first. She just sat down on the stone bench a few feet away from him and looked out at the courtyard. Roy kept writing. Neither of them spoke for a while, and it was not an awkward silence. It was the silence of 2 people who were both comfortable enough with quiet to let it sit between them without filling it. Then Sarah said that she could feel it when he was concentrating. Roy looked up. She said it carefully, like she was still figuring out how to describe it. Through the bond, she said, there was a kind of settling. A stillness. Like when a fire burns down to its steadiest point, not roaring, just glowing. She said it happened whenever he was reading or writing. Roy considered this. He said that was interesting and asked what it felt like when he was sleeping. Sarah said it felt like embers in a covered hearth. Steady and low and warm. Roy wrote that down. Sarah watched him write it down and something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but close. She said she was not sure whether to be pleased or unsettled that he was taking notes on her descriptions of his own soul. Roy said he was taking notes on everything. It was nothing personal. This time she did smile. Just briefly. But it was real. They fell into a quiet pattern after that. Mornings, Sarah would find him in the outer hall. Sometimes she talked. Sometimes she just sat. Roy always listened when she talked, and when he responded it was always honest and direct. No flattery, no careful maneuvering, just his actual thoughts, offered plainly. Sarah was not used to that. She had grown up in a clan where words were layered things. Where what you said and what you meant were often 2 different shapes. Where people spoke around difficult things rather than through them. Roy did not seem to know how to do that. Not because he was careless, she could feel through the bond that he thought before he spoke, but because when he had finished thinking he simply said the true thing. It was strange. She kept waiting for it to become irritating. It did not become irritating. On the 4th day, Marin called them both to the inner chamber. It was a smaller room than the great hall, low-ceilinged and warm, with a single flame burning in a stone bowl at the center. Marin was already seated when they arrived. She had a very old book open on her lap, the kind where the pages had been repaired so many times that the thread holding them together was almost as old as the paper. She told them she had been reading since the night of the ceremony. She said that the rite of the first breath was older than anyone in the clan had understood. The version they practiced now was thousands of years old. But she had found in the oldest text she owned an earlier version, a description of the rite from before the great clans had separated, from a time when dragons and humans had still lived in the same highlands and shared the same fires. She read from it slowly. The original rite, she said, had never specified dragon to dragon. The old word said only, soul to soul. Courage to courage. The flame, the text said, does not ask what kind of bones surround it. It asks only whether the heart that carries it is worthy. The clan had forgotten that. Over 1,000 years of practicing the rite only among themselves, they had simply assumed it was meant only for dragons. The way you assume a door is locked if you have never tried the handle. Roy had tried the handle. Without knowing it. Without meaning to. And the flame had opened. Marin closed the book and looked at both of them. She said the bond between them was not an accident or a mistake. It was the rite working exactly as it was originally designed to work. She said this plainly, and then she left them alone in the room with the small flame and the old warm air. They sat quietly for a moment. Then Sarah asked Roy what he wanted to do now. She asked it carefully because she understood that he had not chosen any of this and she thought that mattered. Roy was quiet for a while. He looked at the flame in the stone bowl. Then he said that he had spent most of his life walking from one place to another looking for things worth writing about. He said that in 3 weeks here he had filled more pages than in the previous 6 months. He said the clan was careful and proud and honest in their own way, and that Marin was one of the most remarkable people he had ever met, and that Sarah herself was. He paused and chose his words, difficult to stop thinking about. He said he wanted to stay. Not because of the ember in his chest. Not because of the bond or the trials or anything that had happened in the ceremony hall. But because for the first time in a long time he had found people worth knowing. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. The ember in her chest, the part of her fire soul that had gone into him, pulsed once, warm and steady. She said quietly that she was glad he had been standing behind that pillar. Roy said he was glad the rope had held as long as it did. Sarah looked at him. Then she laughed. It was a short sound, surprised out of her, and it lit up the small room the way the flame in the bowl could not quite manage on its own. Roy smiled and went back to his notebook. But he was still smiling when he wrote. They began arriving on the 7th day. Roy noticed it first from the window of the outer hall. A shape in the sky, large and slow and deliberate, the way a thing moves when it is not in a hurry because it knows it will be received. Then another shape behind it. Then 3 more, coming from a different direction entirely, moving in loose formation against the pale morning sky. He watched them for a moment, then went to find Marin. She already knew. She was standing in the courtyard with her hands folded and her eyes on the sky, and she did not look surprised. She looked like someone who had been expecting a letter and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. She told Roy, without turning to look at him, that word had traveled faster than she had anticipated. The awakening of an ember seed was not a quiet thing, she said. The oldest dragon bloodlines felt it the way you feel a change in the weather. Not with your eyes but in your bones before the clouds even appear. They had come to see for themselves. By midday there were 11 clans represented in and around the Highland Hall. Some Roy recognized from his research, their markings, their colors, the particular way they held themselves that he had read about in old texts and was now seeing in person for the first time. Others he did not recognize at all. They were older clans, quieter ones, the kind that did not appear in most of the manuscripts he had read because they had chosen long ago to stay out of recorded history. They were all very large. Roy stood in the outer hall and looked at the gathered crowd and took a slow, careful breath. Sarah appeared at his side. She did not say anything. She just stood there, close enough that her arm was almost touching his, and that was enough. Through the bond he felt her steadiness, deliberate and offered, the way you hand someone a lamp when you can see the path ahead of them is dark. He was grateful for it. Marin called the gathering to order in the great hall as the afternoon light came through the high stone windows and long pale columns. Every clan took their place. The hall had not been this full in a very long time. Roy could feel it in the air, the weight of old things being present in the same room at the same time. He stood at the front. Marin introduced him briefly and without ceremony. She said his name. She said he was a traveling scholar. She said he carried a living ember seed, awakened 6 days ago during the rite of the first breath. Then she stepped back and left him standing there alone in front of 11 dragon clans and said nothing more. Roy looked out at the hall. He had no prepared speech. He had thought about preparing one and then decided against it, because he had found in his years of traveling that prepared speeches had a way of sounding like prepared speeches and people, or dragons, could always tell. He said that he wanted to be honest with them because he thought they deserved that. He said he was not a warrior. He was not a leader or a diplomat or anyone particularly important. He was a man who walked from place to place writing things down because he believed that the things people had forgotten were often worth remembering. He said he had come to the Highland Hall because he had read about the dragon clans in old books and had wanted to see if the books were accurate. He said, with complete seriousness, that the books had been significantly underwritten. A low sound moved through the hall. Not quite laughter. Something warmer than that. He said that he had not chosen what happened to him in the ceremony. He had been standing quietly behind a pillar and then he had woken up changed, and he had done his best to handle that with some dignity, though he was honestly not sure how well he had managed. He said the ember in his chest was not his achievement. He had simply turned out to be the kind of ground where an old seed could grow. He paused for a moment. Then he said the thing he had been thinking about for 6 days, since Marin had read from the oldest text in the inner chamber. He said that he had spent his whole life studying what people had forgotten. And the thing that had been forgotten here, the thing the old text described, the original rite, the one that said soul to soul and courage to courage and did not mention species at all, that was not a small thing to forget. He said that 1,000 years was a long time to leave a door closed. But closed was not the same as locked. And he was living proof. He said that the handle still worked. The hall was very still. He said he did not know what came next. He was a scholar, not a planner. But he thought that if 11 clans had flown from across the land to stand in the same room, perhaps that was a beginning worth paying attention to. Then he stopped talking because he had said everything true that he had to say. For a moment nobody moved. Then the oldest dragon in the room, a vast and silver creature from a clan Roy had no name for, seated at the very back of the hall, lowered her great head slowly and deliberately. One by one the others did the same. Roy stood very still and did not fully trust himself to speak. He felt a hand on his chest. Sarah had stepped forward. She pressed her palm flat against his sternum, just below the collarbone where the ember lived. She could feel it through her own hand, steady and warm and real, the piece of her fire soul that had found its home in ground that was older and deeper than anyone had known. She had knelt beside an unconscious human in a moment of desperation. She had kissed him to save herself. She understood now that she had done something else entirely. She had struck the first match. And the world, after 1,000 years of cold and forgetting, was finally beginning to remember what it felt like to be warm.